So on my side, it says it's Henry Olonga, and the name of the song is called Zimbabwe 2011, the 10th anniversary version. So Tapiwa will really confirm it for us because he's the one that selected this song for us this morning as we go into Africa. You find us in the third and final hour of the show at 8 minutes after 2 o'clock. A very good morning to you. If you've just joined us, you missed a lot in terms of the past 2 hours of the show, but you're welcome to really just go into the last hour with us this morning. It's a jam-packed one. It's an interesting one. We are gonna go into the heavy one, the heavy conversation, but just wrap it up on a lighter note. Malik is here. He'll be joining us in studio at the bottom of the hour as we get candid with him this morning. You still find us live on 0861987000. This is our Africa Focus feature, and this is where then we go into Africa, bringing it to you, for you, every single Friday without fail here. And this morning we're intentional about going into Zimbabwe. Hence, Tapiwa selected that song called Our Land, Our Zimbabwe. Tapiwa, good morning. Welcome to the show.
Good morning to you, and good morning to the listeners of Power FM from the land with breath and the rest of the world. It is always a pleasure to be part and parcel of this magnificent show.
Awesome, man. Tapiwa joining us this morning as an Afro expert in democracy, governance, and human rights, just helping us look at developments within the continent. And there's a lot, right, in terms of the work that we see being done by the African Development Bank. A lot of people just looking at how then the bank just moves to help some of the nations here, especially on the continent. And this is exactly what we saw happening for those in Zimbabwe. But before we even go into that song, was I right in saying that that would be Henry Olonga?
No, definitely you are correct. That is Henry Olonga, the former cricket great of Zimbabwe, who played cricket and was one of the very first people in Zimbabwe to be exiled as a sports person, because during the World Cup, which was hosted by South Africa and Zimbabwe, he had played with the black armband, on his arm, in solidarity with the people of Zimbabwe who were being tortured and abused under the government of ZANU-PF, which was led by Robert Mugabe. So he sang that song just before he went into exile, and it was a big hit in Zimbabwe.
It does look like the tenure of Robert Gabriel Mugabe would have been somewhat of a tumultuous one for the people of Zimbabwe, if you look at it in one aspect, looking at also some of the reversals of his decisions that are taking place as we speak right now, today, and others would even attribute some of the socioeconomic challenges in Zimbabwe to some of the tenures. One would be the tenure of Robert Gabriel Mugabe. Maybe just give us a sense of Zimbabwe then, and how we see Zimbabwe then moving to change into what it becomes today.
So what we had, like any other African country, if there's one thing that we need to take note of, is how the former colonial master managed to build, from whatever they'd taken the African continent, not specifically only focusing on Zimbabwe. We know from the 800s, when they grabbed land, forcefully so to say, in that particular point, they managed to build the infrastructural development that was put by the former colonial master was long-lasting. So it then means that any government of the day which would take power, they would come in, there's already infrastructure which is operational. If people are good, they'll be able to sustain it. But if the leadership of the day is bad, issues to do with corruption, the mushrooming of corruption, people plowing the profits and the proceeds of government into their own pockets, it then means people then run the country down. And to run the country down, you need about 15 to 20 years. That's why you see many countries in the African continent, they have struggled at least 15 to 20 years after taking over power from the former colonial master. That is exactly what happened to if we look into the southern African part of the African continent, would see that most of the countries, South Africa being included as well, have struggled at least 15 to 20 years after attaining independence. This is when wheels start coming off. This is when issues of corruption starts to manifest. This is when wheels start coming off, and a lot of issues will be involved. Your roads, you start having potholes, you start running out of water, you start having issues to do with electricity. So those are some of the telltale signs of misgovernance, as the African continent is concerned. And Zimbabwe was not spared from that. So when Robert Mugabe was ruling, it took from independence in 1980, with the Zimbabwean dollar at that particular point in time going 1:1 with the British pound. It was very powerful. There was serious, farming which was in the country based on the commercial farmers, whom, based on statistics, they are about 5% of the total population, but they were controlling about 95% of the land in Zimbabwe. There were Lancaster which were there, which meant to address the issues of colonial issues that had to do with addressing inequalities, land inequalities, independence. But obviously, the former colonial master Britain did not fulfill that promise. And came 2000, when we were coming off for ZANU-PF, what the government, through the war veterans, they then went into the farms and grabbed land in the manner and fashion that they did, which was haphazard. But I would say this is exactly how land was taken in the first place.
So land does become really the apex, right? It comes one that is a common thread, a common feature at the center of where Zimbabwe finds itself today. The issue of the commercial farming, we hear that people were dispossessed, and there are a lot of issues that played themselves out. Hence, we see a lot of people talking about the controversial land program that came through to take away, then to build Zimbabwe. Hence, we're seeing all of those, all of these developments playing themselves out of late around reversing or turning the developments, or somewhat of the things that happened back then that are centered around the land and commercial farming. This would be white farmers that were affected as well.
No, definitely. You see, land becomes key and critical. We can't underestimate, the importance of being in control of the means of production, being in control of the means of production in land, being in control of the means of production even in news. That is where one person gets power from. So as far as the land issue is concerned in Zimbabwe, that is where there was serious production, because Zimbabwe was the bread basket of Africa. Never mind the pint, that it's a pint-sized country, but it was the bread basket of Africa, producing a lot of maize, a lot of wheat, producing a lot of tobacco, and all of that, because land is very key and critical. When there were farm graves in the year 2000, after the emergency of the workers' union-led opposition party from the working class was disgruntled due to the serious levels of corruption in the country. And as a result, through the Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Union, that then formed the Movement for Democratic Change, which was led by the Secretary General of the ZCTU, Morgan Tsvangirai, together with Gibson Sibanda, and then faced ZANU-PF head on. In the matrix of that was also when ZANU-PF and Robert Mugabe was also about to lose power, and as a result, the only thing which was left to salvage power was getting the land back. Between you and I, land is critical and land is important. People need to get land because this land belongs to Africans, But obviously, when you have a lot of white commercial farmers, the former colonial masters, who had attained this particular land in a brutal manner and fashion, people were killed. Our great-great-grandparents and fathers, they were killed. They were brutally murdered. There was no compensation done to address the issues of the inequality as far as land is concerned. And for me, I say it is sad for an African child, to see that the Zimbabwean government at this particular point in time has made an undertaking to pay. I think they've already dished out about 58 million in terms of rands to the former commercial farmers, and the aim, in terms of the calculations, to distribute about 300 million US dollars to the former colonial white commercial farmers in the country, because they've lost the land and they have lost their livelihood. So I've seen a lot of presidents from Africa, saying that, no, look, this has to do with national healing. But trust me, this process totally ignores how land was taken. It totally ignores why, as the African child, we went into war, the liberation movements. It totally ignores that, because all these colonial masters, they have not taken accountability just to apologize. They've not done that. But we find ourselves in this predicament, political, social, and economic quagmire, where we now have to repay back the people who had attained this land for next to nothing. The value that was there was the blood of the black child, which is still flowing in the streams and in the wilderness.
Tapiwa Diamond Chadya is here with us as an Afro expert in democracy, governance, and human rights this morning, helping us just to go into Africa, to go into Zimbabwe, looking at all of these developments around the country. And the reason why we're putting Zimbabwe under the spotlight this morning is because we saw this week the African Development Bank moving into Zimbabwe, launching this groundbreaking compensation program aimed at former white commercial farmers displaced during the country's controversial land reform program. They were being assisted in terms of reclaiming some of their land there, which is why then I started by trying to understand how we find ourselves here, what would be at the center of Zimbabwe's demise, if you look at it, looking at some of these challenges that would exist here. But economically, how did the disposition, the displacement of these farmers then mean for Zimbabwe's economy, looking at the the stark socioeconomic challenges that would exist in the country as we speak right now? So you're at home, you're still welcome, really, to form part of this conversation on 0861 987 000. Thereby X, we go by at PowerFM 987, at Katlego Legodi _ Tapiwa, let's talk about this launch, right? This program by the African Development Bank. We see them moving into Zimbabwe. It's described as a landmark compensation deal. It's described as well as somewhat of a deal that comes through to reverse some of the developments within Zimbabwe. We see some of the farmers, and one wonders as to where would they have gone when those displacement would take shape. Would they have stayed within Zimbabwe even though they were stripped of their land? Do we see them maybe picking up and moving and taking their investments elsewhere or starting their lives elsewhere? We see the AFDB now moving into Zimbabwe through this compensation deal.
So during the year 2000, when the opposition, the Movement for Democratic Change was formed, because the former colonial masters, the white commercial farmers, they were starting to feel the impact and the brand of corruption from ZANU-PF. They then started sponsoring the Movement for Democratic Change. That also infuriated, the people in ZANU-PF, because they then came out with policies where they were now saying land to the people, policies that would say that Zimbabwe will never be a colony again. There's no way. This is what the war veterans were saying that to be over their dead bodies, that the former colonial master can come back again and rule Zimbabwe through the aid of the opposition party. So this is also some of the reasons why we also had a brutal land redistribution and land grab at that particular point in time. But what it did, at the end of the day, it definitely killed the economy, because most of these white commercial farmers, they were the ones feeding the industries, your David Whitehead textiles, your mining companies. As a result, after the year 2000, coming into 2008, a lot of industries shut down in the country. And you know how it is. When your industries shut down, it then means that you're going to have serious issues that is to do with your economies. Your economy is going to take a serious dent. And Zimbabwe suffered that, the IMF, the World Bank, and people that have to do with foreign direct investment, everyone turned their back on Zimbabwe. There were sanctions which were put on Zimbabwe, economic sanctions, political sanctions, financial sanctions, and Zimbabwe was then isolated, from the rest of the international community. And at that particular point in time, the African community had not, established itself. There was no issues to do with solidarity. That is where, you would have your ECOWAS Bank as an example. Currently we can speak about the African Development Bank. They would have come in had there been that type of solidarity and assisted the country to move forward and then join hands together and fight the former colonial masters. But unfortunately, the country failed, to come back from its knees, especially as far as the economics of the day are concerned. And today, most of the industries which closed, they've not been able to open. That's why there's serious levels of unemployment in the country of Zimbabwe. So the African Development Bank coming in, on the sidelines, speaking about compensation and national healing, obviously what it does is that it bolsters the investor confidence of the country as well, as far as the IMF and the World Bank projections. When we look at the books, they've been saying that the country has been slowly coming back to its former glory. But look, it is a process that is going to take a long period of time, and a lot of harm has been done on the ground, and it will take quite a lot of work to bring back the country again to where it was. Because currently, as we speak, the reports have been that the industries have not been opened yet in the country. As a result, you'd still have a serious population which is still suffering in the country. And it affects the means of production.
So how do we see the AFDB then, reversing some of these issues that took place back then? Do we see this program becoming successful? Do we see it coming through to also help in reviving the economy of Zimbabwe? How does it come through to turn things around?
It will to some extent, bolster investor confidence, because what you would need, you need to still have foreign direct investment. You still need people and external people to come into the country and develop and pump in a bit of money. You still need to sign those bilateral relations, multilateral relations, because that is where, we then are able to bolster the economics of the day. But what becomes key and critical is that, when everyone is speaking good about you, saying, no, look, the country is going through a steady reform, it then means that you're going to have quite a number of people coming into the country and investing. But, news on the ground is that the majority of the investments which have been happening in the country as far as lithium is concerned, gold and diamonds and other mineral resources, have to do with the Chinese coming back again with a new world face in terms of the colonization, new different type of colonization which is happening in the country of Zimbabwe. But generally speaking, there's been some good which has been coming out of the country, and there's been some investors who have been going in and trying to make sure that the country can come back, to its former glory. But as you know, There is no free lunch in Africa. As long as you have investors coming and investing in the country, there's always a catch. There's always something that they'll take away that we won't see. Only 15, 20 years down the line will be when we start suffering from all these things. So this is where the African Development Bank should come in, because it is a pipeline dream for us as Africans to try and invest and assist one another and keep the resources internally.
I want us to wrap it up with Semi, who's calling us from Pretoria. We're out of time, Tapiwa, but Semi has a view here. We'll just listen to what Semi has to say, come back, wrap it up, and look to the future where Zimbabwe is concerned. Semi, you're calling us from Pretoria. Good morning. Welcome to the show.
Good morning, Katlego, your guest. Katlego, first of all, this whole thing of African people always referring to themselves as African child, African child, this, that, and the other. When are they going to grow up and stop referring to themselves as children? You're not a child. Stop saying African child. You're an adult. And that's the reason why Africa will never get anywhere, because you have adults referring to themselves as African child. You're not a child. You're an adult. Take responsibility. The reason why Africa finds itself in the situation that it is today is not because of colonialism. When colonialists left, there was infrastructure going on and on. There were systems functioning properly. The African people, the African leaders, when they getting charged, took over. Instead of continuing what was left, they plundered resources. They looted everything. Zimbabwe, for example, I hear your guest talking about how they have to repay the former white farmers for the land that was they obtained illegally. Sure, they obtained from, but they didn't obtain it illegally. No, it was taken by the colonialists, and those white farmers, they bought it. It wasn't given free to them, contrary to popular belief. They bought it for a cheap price. But when the Zimbabwean government got into power, instead of equipping Zimbabweans with skills so that when the land was taken from white farmers, instead of equipping Zimbabweans with skills, what did they do? They never did that. Instead, in fact, ZANU-PF itself, they had murdered Zimbabweans. They've done atrocities against black people themselves. So what Zimbabwe and other African people find themselves today is it's no longer because of colonialism. Let's face it. Take South Africa, for example. A good example is South Africa. The African leaders, when they got into power, instead of equipping African people with skills, what did they do? They resorted to corruption. Look at ESCOM. I can name it all and all.
So what become the lessons that we learn from all of these? Because we see the Africa Development Bank now moving with this compensation fund and rounding up some of these farmers to say that let's start reviving the agricultural space of Zimbabwe through this program. What become the lessons that would be learned here that then won't see somewhat of a repeat of what happened here, something that saw the economy affected?
That the looting and the corruption doesn't work. What's happened in Zimbabwe is the same thing that the likes of EFF are advocating for: land expropriation without compensation.
So the lesson would be what? The reading of the corruption. That would be the lessons that we learn from this. Because I wanted to get the lessons.
Get rid of this corruption and get rid of this socialist mentality of thinking that you can take land from people without compensation. That will never work. It never worked anywhere in the world. This whole thing of land expropriation without compensation, that's what it happened in Zimbabwe. And if we don't learn a lesson from that, that's where South Africa will find itself. Not even in 20 years' time. No, in 5 years' time.
Awesome. Semi, thank you very much, man, for your contribution this morning.
Sure.
Semi calling us from Pretoria. Tapiwa, I want us to wrap it up in terms of what then becomes the future where Zimbabwe is concerned, especially if we are seeing some of these developments. You hear Semi just worried about issues of corruption, issues of land grabs, expropriation without compensation, saying that we may then find ourselves, we may as well find ourselves back here if we don't, in any way correct that going into the future. What become the future, especially where some of these programs are concerned?
We need systems in place. There should be a willingness from administrators and politicians to deal with issues to do with corruption. That becomes very key. Misgovernance. Semi is right in raising and pointing out the issues that you have said. The issue has to do with the leadership that we have. We have different types of leaders who are simply just there to loot. So I believe that becomes key and critical in terms of moving forward. Administratively, we need to put people in power, not comrades and cadres, not friends or allies, but people who are able to do the job, people who are completely sold out to making sure that wherever they are, they do their job very well and they refrain from corruption. These institutions and systems which are there to curb corruption, they should also work independently and tighten the grip, and so as to that we eradicate corruption, because that is where most of these issues on the wheels are coming off and siphoning out of mineral resources and funds for our communities. So corruption becomes very key in terms of what is addressed by each and every single government in Africa.
Awesome. Tapiwa, I want us to leave it here for this morning. Thank you very much for coming through, for giving us your time as well. There's a lot of lessons to be learned here, and we'll keenly watch Zimbabwe. Also, the socioeconomic issues there are stuck. So we need to see the country starting to work, especially for its people. But we see some of these developments then being somewhat of a welcome relief, especially even for those that would be in Zimbabwe. Thank you very much, Tapiwa, for giving us your time this morning.